Hello and a very warm welcome to Middle East Matters. I'm Eve Irvine. Losing ground, faced with a series of simultaneous operations by local and coalition forces, the Islamic State group is weakening its hold across the Middle East. A summer camp in New Mexico brings together young Palestinians and Israelis, getting them to share their experiences of growing up on both sides of the conflict. And France 24's Observers team takes a look at the consumption of porn and how habits are changing across the Middle East. The Islamic State group is losing territory from Raqqa in Syria to Tal Afar in Iraq and even the Lebanese desert. The jihadists are gradually being worn down by a series of US-backed operations. Tal Afar was once home to some 200,000 people, many of whom have been forced to flee, as Haxi Myers-Belkin reports.
As the US-led coalition continues its push towards Tal Afar, civilians pour into a humanitarian centre west of Mosul.
2 women died on the way. The whole trip was a nightmare. An old woman from Tal Afar was left behind by her family between 2 mountains. She asked us to take her, but we couldn't carry her.
Some 40,000 people had already left the area surrounding Tal Afar in the months leading up to the offensive, but the UN says they're expecting thousands more to flee as coalition forces close in on the Islamic State group's last stronghold in northern Iraq. The Iraqi army announcing it's already recaptured half a dozen villages, as well as key parts of the road connecting Tal Afar to Mosul.
Our units have reached Kisik Junction and brought it under their full control. Now, as you can see, the engineering team is clearing the road of explosives to open a supply line for the troops.
It's certainly progress, but these troops know the greatest challenge begins when they reach the streets of Tal Afar, where they'll come face to face with the 2,000 jihadists they believe are waiting for them. In neighbouring Syria, meanwhile, government loyalists continue to resist at Deir es-Zor and also further west at al-Sukna. Further north, meanwhile, opposition fighters backed by US airstrikes have surrounded the group's makeshift capital, Raqqa. The Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces now hold more than half the city.
That continuous swathe of territory that the group used to hold across Syria and Iraq, that's been totally destroyed. It marks the end of the group's state-building project.
But the jihadists' ambitions haven't been limited to Syria and Iraq. The IS group has occupied a mountainous area in Lebanon near its Syrian border since 2014. After the most recent phase of its anti-IS offensive, the Lebanese army says it's recaptured some 2/3 of the enclave. Around 600 jihadists are now caught between the Lebanese army on one side and Hezbollah and the Syrian army on the other. Although Lebanon insists that with financial and strategic support from the US, it doesn't need to coordinate with Damascus.
The Lebanese army is concerned only by recovering the sovereignty of the Lebanese state on Lebanese soil. The Lebanese army is very successful in the operation and doesn't need any support from the other side of the border.
Lebanon may prefer to see its operation as separate from those in Syria and Iraq, but all 3 offensives attest to the same thing. The Islamic State group is losing ground.
Yemen has been caught in a bitter conflict for almost 3 years now after Houthi rebels swept into the capital and overthrew the government there in 2014. With the civil war ongoing, today Yemen has a new battle on its hands. It's suffering from the biggest outbreak of cholera anywhere in the world. Around 500,000 people infected. Elizabeth Walsh has more.
The advice coming from the megaphones is that of Mutab and her colleagues, who are traveling the streets of Aden on a minibus. They're part of a medical team going door to door in this Yemeni port city to warn families of the rapidly spreading cholera epidemic.
We're going from house to house to tell people how important our message is. We educate them about personal hygiene and how to properly wash their hands. We give them practical tips and show them how to properly implement the guidance.
The disease arose out of the civil war that has ravaged Yemen for more than 2 years. The conflict has destroyed infrastructure, especially water pumping stations and water distribution networks. Mutab shows families how to properly treat their drinking water as cholera develops in stagnant and unclean water.
This isn't good. You have to cover the container with a plastic cover or a bag. If we change the way things are done, we can help prevent the disease.
According to the World Health Organization, nearly all people affected by cholera can survive if they receive adequate treatment. However, nearly 15 million people in Yemen do not have access to basic health care.
Forming new friendships in New Mexico for the last 2 decades, a summer camp aimed at fostering peace, dialogue and an understanding of the other has brought young Israelis and Palestinians together. 3 weeks of classes focused on how to listen and get women to share their experiences of growing up on either side of the conflict.
After just a few weeks of American summer camp, Lama and Eden are inseparable. A friendship that would have never blossomed back home, 11,000 kilometers away, where they find themselves on opposing sides of the Israel-Palestine conflict.
If someone put a hijab, so they can't think there is a terrorist or something bad, and it's not right. So now I know that I'm gonna change something, and if someone gonna say something wrong on the Arabs, so I'm gonna protect them.
Trying to know more about each other, like feel with each other. Like we knew a lot of things that we couldn't imagine before, so we're now real good friends.
For the past 20 years, this ranch in the hills of New Mexico has hosted 20 Israeli and Palestinian teenagers every summer. 3 weeks of shared living, activities and memories.
Those little things we do that trying to help and promoting peace. Yeah, it's not like math. There's no one solution that can help to everybody, but we have one thing in common and we want peace.
Paid for through private US donations, the program hopes to foster trust and break down barriers.
It'll be up to these young women to do the work, and I believe they absolutely can. It's important for them to be strong enough to be able to work for peace even under very adverse conditions, and that we want them to go out into the world and take action and make things better.
Soon they'll return home to Israel or the Palestinian territories and will have to try to hold on to the lessons they've learnt here, despite being surrounded by a conflict that's lasted almost 70 years.
Well, helped no doubt with the advent of the internet and the relative degree of anonymity it offers, pornography has become an increasing part of lives everywhere. Our Observers team have been looking at the consumption of porn in the Middle East, notably in Egypt. Derek Thompson is with us in studio. Derek, firstly, why the interest in looking at Egypt in particular?
Well, we were looking at traffic to porn sites in different countries, and we noticed that the same 4 or 5 big global porn sites show up with roughly the same incidence in the top 50 most visited sites, whatever country you're looking at, whether it's France or the UK or the US or India or the Middle East. We found roughly the same pattern, the same 4 or 5 sites which were showing up, and people were consulting them in Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, Egypt, Lebanon, even in Syria and Yemen, as far as those figures go. So we decided to look at Egypt just because it's the biggest country in the Arab world.
OK, so you got people, I believe, there to speak to you openly about it. What did they have to say? Well,
we spoke to 2 men and 1 woman. They came from various social backgrounds. They were all professionals. One of the men came from a relatively conservative family. His wife wears the veil. The woman we spoke to, she came from a conservative background as well. She wears the veil. She travels internationally between boyfriends. She admitted that she watches porn sometimes. She says she feels guilty about it. But what astonished me and what surprised me is that they all talked about it openly with us. It was anonymously, of course. They didn't want their names being used. And one of the men even had a conversation with some of his friends, and they talked openly about what they watch and why.
Okay, so not at all a taboo, it sounds there. I don't want too many details, but what kind of thing did they watch?
They watched, I don't want to give details either, but they watched the same kind of thing as people around the world. But we looked at Google Trends, and we found that the search term that Egyptians use most when they're looking for porn was Arab. Now, that's not surprising. It's an Arabic country. But the people we spoke to said they don't like the quote-unquote Arab porn that is produced by the Western commercial industry that uses actors who are not Arab typically, and they dress them up in Arab clothing, and it's very degrading to women, to men. The people we spoke to don't like that. They told us that there is an informal market in Egypt that's grown up of locally produced porn using local people, and that is actually passed from phone to phone. It's not on the internet, it's passed from phone to phone via WhatsApp, sometimes with small payments. So they have their own market for that. Sex tapes are big in Egypt as well. I didn't know. There was a case a couple of years ago of a Salafist whose private sex tapes were leaked. That caused a big controversy. And then this Ramadan, in the month of Ramadan, that's when Egyptian TV launches its big shows. One of the big shows was actually about the release of a sex tape. So it's very much in the public discourse.
So, Derek, what kind of conclusions then can we draw from all of that?
Well, really just that, for better or worse, pornography has become part of daily life for hundreds of millions of people around the world, at least people who have access to the internet.
OK, Derek, thanks a lot for that. Well, that wraps it up for this edition of Middle East Matters. Don't forget to follow us on our Facebook page, and do, of course, stay tuned to France 24.
Inside the Americas, presented by Jeannie Godula.
From North America to the southern tip of Patagonia, join us for a look at the latest political, economic, cultural and social news from the Americas.
Inside the Americas on France 24 and France24.com.